Gaetano Mosca, like all Machiavellians, Anna, rejects any monistic view of history. And that is any theory of history which holds that there is one single cause that accounts for everything that happens in society. And really smart people like us and Mencius Moldbug know that it's a bunch of stuff.
I'm glad that you name Gaetano Mosca, because I'm going to quote him in a minute, and I like forgot what his first name was.
Well, yeah,
because I read this book like 2 or 3 weeks ago, and it's all a blur.
His name is Gaetano.
Yeah,
I read it on the plane, on Adderall, so I was really, because I was so pissed off because I still hadn't really read the Vanity Fair article, but I was like, they don't like my politics, and they don't even realize that I don't even have politics. But wait until I read this book and I get some, and I become even more reactionary and even more annoying. Yeah. And I start identifying as like a monarchist or something else weird,
or like retarded.
But then actually something I gleaned from this book that did resonate was that there's a ruling class and a ruled class.
Right.
And the majority of people are...
The iron law of oligarchy.
The majority of people are getting ruled anyway.
But we already gleaned this on one of our first episodes of all time when Stephen Phillips Horse said 95% of people are bottoms.
Exactly.
It's funny, like, again, what men write elaborate analytical treatises about and what women and homosexuals kind of intuitively know to be true from experience.
Yeah, absolutely.
But yeah, I think his chief insight, Burnham's chief insight, is that society tends toward oligarchy in the way that it organizes itself.
Yeah.
And given that reality, democracy is in fact not a competing political system, but a useful political process and political myth.
Yeah.
And how he like sets himself apart from the flock of other political theorists is that he's at least attempting to proceed inductively through a careful kind of scientific or observational study of historical facts and human behavior, rather than deductively from certain like presumptive and high-minded like ideals or wishes about human nature.
Yeah. He did the autism for us, so we didn't have to. And we love him for that.
Yeah. The picture that emerges of democracy is like a rather bleak one. Democracy, much like happiness, is not a permanent state. It's a temporary condition. Like, in other words, it's not a political model, it's a political tool.
Right. And in order for there to be the best you can sort of aspire to is not like a utopian ideal, because they're necessarily doomed. Yeah. Because as political scientists, we're doing facts here. Dante.
We're adding another label to our multi-hyphenate status.
Don't spare me your politics of wishes, okay? Because I'm here to talk about the facts and the truth and freedom, which I all love. And the best societies are the ones in which there are, you know, checks and balances, so to speak.
What is it, like juridical defense, which is a concept that I admittedly like don't fully understand.
I fully wrote that down though, because I was like, I love it. I was like, I'm all about juridical defense now. And it's the most important part of a healthy civilization, and we don't have it.
No. And so the question becomes not whether society should or shouldn't be ruled by an oligarchy, but what oligarchy will rule it. Yeah. Just in practice, because that's how things shake out. And like, like you see like the democratic process basically functions by submitting kind of a narrow field of representative choices or options to like a referendum or a vote, which
already compromises your sovereignty.
Yeah, and it leads, as we know, usually leads to undemocratic results, right? And then the political myth naturalizes after the fact the rule of this elite minority of people.
Amen.
Yeah. So
you have a Gaetano quote. His name is Gaetano.
Yes. Well, okay. Burnham goes through 4.
Gaetano Mosca, Michelle, or no, Michelle, he has a critique.
Hold on, let's pull this up.
I didn't finish it.
First, in the intro, he like sort of takes apart some political treatise Dante wrote that seemingly appeals to like the divine rights of certain men, but is really just shilling for his political camp of what Burnham perceives are like political traitors.
Yeah.
Then he launches into Machiavelli, then he deals with Mosca, then with Sorel, then with Mickles, and then with Pareto in part.
What about the part where he says that the United States and like Anglo-Saxon societies are like dominated by hypocrisy?
Yeah.
And so they're the most averse to these Machiavellian ideas because they hate the truth.
Well, because they deal in, again, like these high-minded utopian principles that basically amount to manipulation and propaganda.
Yeah.
As we see with the Democratic Party. The book starts on him, you know, he's like a former like Marxist and a former Trotskyite, and the book starts with him kind of dismantling the platform of the Democratic Party in 1932.
Oh, he was a socialist.
Yeah, see, like all... Like
me.
Yeah.
He used to be a socialist, and now
yeah.
he's a total Machiavellian mastermind. No, I'm just kidding.
He got black-pilled.
Well, that's what I thought. I was like, I'm going to read this book. I'm going to become Machiavellian and vanquish my enemies. And then I was like, oh, I'm just a bottom. Like,
yeah, you're a cog in
other
the machine,
people.
Yeah.
And I'm just not going to worry about politics because I'm going to get ruled anyway.
This is like very instructive for me in light of what's happened in the past 4 or 5 years. And he talks about how like that liberalism is but one ideology, but this process happens like regardless of any particular ideology, though every specific ideology at hand basically serves to naturalize the rule of the elites over the masses, in the sense of, if not making it seem natural, making it seem inevitable, right? Giving it the appearance of something unavoidable.
Right.
And that is what the Democratic Party is doing, as we speak at all times.
What was the...
the quote. As I said also on a couple of episodes ago, like in the past you could appeal to like divine right. Now in this day and age we appeal to like human rights and the principle of democracy itself.
Yeah. And well, now there's this like worship of science.
Yeah.
Right. That's sort of in place of like a decaying belief in divinity.
Exactly.
That's also, manufacturing a lot of consent, if you will.
Yeah, that has nothing to do with the scientific method or the scientific process, right? This is like a very trite observation, but the other part of it that was like very kind of...
And my man's Burnham loves the scientific process.
He's trying to do something that's like basically impossible, which is apply the scientific method to politics and like kind of secure the reputation of political science.
Yeah. Through the vector of Machiavelli as an ethical thinker.
Yeah. But that was like I think the most instructive and fulfilling part for me, that, his definition of ethics and then his subsequent defense of Machiavelli and really of himself ultimately as like the ultimate ethicist. This is like where the Mosca quote comes in, but like he basically argues that to the extent that it's even possible, like his idea of ethics asks us to see the world as it is rather than as we want it to be or wish it were. Here's the quote: much like Camille Paglia, Burnham sees society not as like a strictly oppressive force, but as a quote reciprocal restraint for human individuals by one another, which makes them better not by destroying their wicked instincts but by accustoming them to controlling their wicked instincts. And actually, I was thinking that this kind of outlook or philosophy is the through line that unites all of my favorite thinkers and writers and artists, from Lash to Didion to Morrissey to Haneke. Like they all have this very kind of like realpolitik view of the world.
Pessimism.
Right.
He refers to it at one point. I forget in what context.
Well, I mean, what he's really
Sorrow?
Reacting to and rejecting on its face is this Rousseauian tradition, which basically holds that man is innately good, that he is born an innocent, that in his natural state he favors truth and justice, and that it is society in the final analysis that makes him wicked and corrupt and cynical. And that's also like a very Pollian outlook. I said this also before, like my attraction to his theory and my critique of it are like essentially one and the same, in that I view his view as highly plausible and highly accurate, but also like overly deterministic to the point of being cynical. You know, you can say, well, the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior until it isn't.
Until there's that black swan.
Yeah.
Taleb.
And you have to, I think, give people room to dream and imagine outside of like worldly parameters.
Oh, definitely. Yeah.
Which is why people can have some socialism as a treat.
And some religion.
Yeah. You know, like I'll be the first to admit that I find it very challenging to think outside those worldly parameters, which is like why I'm often understandably accused of being like insufficiently emotional or empathetic. And it's not that I don't have emotions or empathy. It's that I suppress any public display of those things because in my mind it feels manipulative and propagandistic.
Right.
Like I feel like I'm hawking something if I start crying about Ukrainian refugees in public.
Of course. No,
So
I
yeah,
understand. Yeah.
I think overall, like this book, when you read it, you're just like nodding along with it and you're like, this is so obvious. Why did you have to?
But then it kind of hits.
Yeah.
It definitely, well, I literally, it was the only book I brought and I was on the plane and I was like, okay, Dosh. Just,
I like how he quotes Hitler amply. I think it's all like taken from Mein Kampf, which is a book I haven't read.
no, of course not.
And I think even like the basic stuff, like he says, like, what are we talking about when we talk politics? Many, to judge by what they write, seem to think that we are talking about man's search for ideally good society or his mutual organization or the maximum social welfare or his natural aspiration for peace and harmony or something equally removed from the world as it is and has been. Machiavelli understood politics as primarily the study of the struggles for power among men, which is where Peter Thiel comes in.
And where I'm kind of checking out. Because the last thing I really want is power.
Well, yeah. That's why I love Jerry Garcia.
Be affiliated with it in any way.
Well, you have to assume some level of power, right? Which is scary and unpleasant.
Well, sure.
Because then
in certain avenues, but politically, I mean,
right.
No. For
yeah,
me?
I mean, and that explains why like so many of our elected officials today are just like, they feel like they were made in a lab.
Yeah.
They're like these glib and charismatic, but actually not figures like Macron and Obama and Trudeau, who are basically just like status mongers.
Won in
he did,
France.
yeah. I figured he would.
Yeah.
But Marine Le Pen got like 40% of the vote.
She got up there, yeah.
It's funny because if you look at the demographics, older voters in France prefer Macron and younger voters prefer Le Pen. Like that's the new right you should be writing about. Vanity Fair reporter, not some random podcasters and like poets on the Lower East Side. Like, what are you talking about?
Yeah. Well, it's also just a little too late, you know?
Yeah.
I have, to your point of sort of nodding along to the obviousness of some of Burnham's points while admiring their like autistic clarity and coherence. So he talks about democratic and aristocratic tendencies. And he says, since all of us in the United States have been educated under democratic formulas, the advantages of the democratic tendency are too familiar to need statement. We less often discuss certain of its disadvantages or some possible advantages of aristocracy. To begin with, so long as the family remains, and in some form it is likely to remain as long as we can foresee, the aristocratic tendency will always be asserting itself to some degree at least. It too accords with this ineradicable human trait, with the fact that since a man cannot help all other men equally, and since all cannot prosper equally, he will prefer as a rule that those should be favored towards whom he feels some special attachment. And I was like, I remember learning about this at women's college when it was called feminist care ethics. Are you familiar with this?
No, not at all.
It's I couldn't. I was in college when I read it, and I should have looked it up, but yeah, it was just the idea that you can't care for everybody. It was like a feminist response to like universality.
Yeah, you can't spread your emotional labor too thin.
You're obviously going to care more
Yeah.
about your family, your children, the people in your life that you have attachments to, and that's not unethical.
Yeah. I mean, I think even like Richard Dawkins of all people made this point. It's a really obvious point that like we can all agree on, but that like gets lost in this like social justice, human rights framework where people are like freaking out at you about why you don't seem to express the kind of reasonable amount of care for like
people you're
total strangers.
Yeah. Things that are completely out of your control as a bottom.
Yeah. And it's funny again because it seems like women have like a natural handle on these type of concepts.
Well, yeah.
Women are the original Machiavellians and the original Straussians because we dwell in that or mud hole in the ground and we're always like figuring out ways to like claw our way out of it. My objection always to this very feminine tendency to overexpress emotions and empathy, like somebody like Taylor Lorenz does very selectively, was always that like I understood that women, like all of us have this, like, you know, when John Berger said, well, you know, men watch and women watch themselves being watched. Yeah, it's much, much worse than that. We like to specifically experience ourselves in self-sacrificing and self-abnegating roles. Everything from Madonna to whore, where you're like a caretaker or cum slut, because the reality is that a lot of our motivations are rather ordinary and utilitarian.
Well, bottoms are, as Sean Monahan, another homosexual, said, are, you know, people who, I think he said New York is full of bottoms.
Yeah.
Because it's full of people who feel special when they get fucked.
I never thought of bottoms that way.
I mean, bottoms, women, whatever.
Yeah, and I think that explains kind of like the natural attraction of most women to being the muse rather than the master. And it's, of course, like, you know, it's like a offloading of responsibility.
Oh, yeah. Being a vessel? What could be better than that?